Cool. I'll turn now to the Water Oversight Committee aspect of this. Just a few things to remind people of. As we said before, our purpose here is to, we all are, people were hurt as part of this, and some people are still recovering. So our purpose here is to make sure that we address the issues this raises so that we can be sure this doesn't happen again. So our purpose is to ensure that we are better prepared and more resilient in the face of continued climate change. So today, again, as has already been said, this is the beginning. Our committee will participate in the next joint committee with Austin Energy at the end of March. We have also decided to schedule another meeting in April. So today, our topics, we have four major topic areas. System overview, which is really what happened. So we will walk through timelines, etc., on what happened to put us in a position where we had low water pressure and a water outage. We will also talk, the second thing we will talk about is communications, preparedness activities and communications. Third thing is the bill relief, financial relief. Fourth thing is community recovery activities. And then we'll take a few minutes at the end to talk about next steps. We will spend most of our time talking about the system overview and the timeline and communications. And that will we will spend about an hour and 15 minutes max on that topic. Then we will turn to the financial relief plan, and we'll spend about 15 minutes max on that topic. And then finally, the support for community recovery activities, which we will spend about 15 minutes on that also. So I'm going to ask that we hold our questions until after we get through the communication activities. So we will have the presentation on the system overview and the communication activities, and then we will pause and take questions. And when you ask questions, I'm going to ask that you ask one question and one follow-up so that we can allow the most number of people to ask questions. And again, this is just beginning. I mean, what we're trying to do is help the public understand generally what happened, start to drill down on what those issues are, which will define how the committee continues to look in more detail at the water issues. So with that said, I'm going to turn this over to Director Masaros.
Hello, Council and Mayor. There we go. Could we start up the presentation material? Thank you. So I am Greg Mazaris, Director of Austin Water, and pleased to be here today. Council, when I last spoke to you, I spoke to you about the great work of our employees. And while they're clearly community heroes, I want you to know, as leader of Austin Water, I understand that it's my responsibility to see that our system operates in a way that doesn't require our employees to be heroes and do heroic things. That's the best way to go about this. Our system becomes more resilient and reliable, and we don't put our employees in the position where they have to do heroic things for the community. And that's my commitment as director, and that's the commitment of all the executives of Austin Water, that we work to get to a more resilient system. As we speak about resiliency, it's really a challenging time for the water industry, particularly here in Austin. We face extended drought periods here in Austin that are being amplified by climate change. Our community has routinely been infected by flash flooding that is also being intensified by more frequency and more intense. And now polar vortexes and storms that are lasting upwards of 5 to 7 days. So, and a challenging set of issues to work through. And when we talk about resiliency, it's not only our infrastructure systems, it's our communication systems, it's also our preparedness. I know with this event, very difficult to secure emergency bottled water, to have water trucks available, other things to support the community through an emergency event. And Austin Water is going to play a more significant role in seeing that those resources are secured and stored prior to any event. It's too difficult to lift those off the ground during an event, to ask our EOC to do that. And just to give you a sense, those are the kind of areas that Austin Water is going to be stepping up and examining and taking steps beyond just the infrastructure of our system. I know that's the city manager's expectation, that we have a thorough and objective multi-part resiliency review. I know that's your expectation as policymakers, and we'll be working with you as you're setting up your IFC and other forums. I have already reached out to the chairman of our commission, Chin Lee, as well as the vice chair, Commissioner Christiane Castleberry, and asked for their assistance through our commission for our after action review and resiliency. They're talented engineers in their own right, and our commission has a lot of talent, and I think it's critical that we involve them in our after action reviews. Not only do they have talents, but they live this event. I spoke to both of them here this week, and both of my chair and co-chair experienced significant water outage periods. They experienced the communication difficulties, and so they have that perspective to add as customers of our utility. I want to speak frankly that you may be feeling demoralized. I know it's something that I certainly felt during the event, and here recently there was a Statesman article about power issues at Ulrich, and that may have felt very demoralizing, and I want to speak to you a little bit about that today in my opening remarks. Water and electric are intimately entwined. As the electric system goes, so goes the water system, and you can't separate the two. And at our Ulrich plant, which is our largest plant, we lost both power feeds. While the plant stayed on the critical circuits, the storm damage and ice-laden branches and trees disabled both power feeds to our plant, and it de-energized. While Austin Water was able to re-energize the system in approximately 5 to 6 minutes, that is not appropriate for us to just start the plant back up. Our plant pulls thousands of horsepowers of energy to drive our pumps and our systems, and a cold start of that plant requires significant checking and manipulation of our systems. What we have to avoid is doing something that would burst a large transmission main, surge the system, a catastrophic failure that would take days or weeks to recover from. And I think as the council examines this and the community examines this, it's very important to understand those kind of issues. I would also speak to the understanding of the context which we were operating under. Extreme conditions and demands on our systems and our staffs. Even with regards to the electrical issues at Ulrich, we had over 20 lift stations out of service from the grid problems. While our major plants are on critical circuits, our smaller facilities embedded in neighborhoods are not. And many of our electricians and staff were in the field during these conditions, trying to move generators around, powering those smaller facilities, cleaning up overflow, and assisting in those ways. We also operate Longhorn Dam for the city. We took over Longhorn Dam operations a couple years ago. We lost power at Longhorn Dam. We had to shift resources to hand crank the gates. These are huge facilities, and our staff hand cranking those, very difficult conditions. And it's just important to understand that we're not all gathered around Ulrich during an emergency, that our systems were spread thin. We had people everywhere, and it was a very challenging situation. I want you to know too that we have systems in place to assess risk and to invest in resiliency. And that's the promise here. Those systems are working. We have a risk-based CIP allocation system. We invest approximately $1 billion every 5 years, and we use risk assessment and resiliency to evaluate those investment areas. And electric reliability and performance is one of those keys. Even at Ulrich, the council may recall that at the end of 2020, you approved a large electrical system investment at Ulrich. We had a lot of discussions on that at the dais. There were some stakeholders concerned on environmental issues and some labor activists concerned about the contractor. In the end, we were successful working with you to get that approved, and that project is under construction now. It took 4 years to prepare that project through engineering, permitting, and design, and now it's in construction. I wish it were done now, but it takes some time to do those. Those are other projects all across the utility at our Davis plant, at our wastewater plants, where we're investing hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure and other reliability and resiliency projects. And we'd like to share that with you in the community as you gather more information of what we're doing and how we can do it better. I think you're seeing the promise, too, of other adaptations that we're taking, and we'll highlight that for you today. But you're all familiar with Water Forward and our advanced meter infrastructure project. We often call it MyATX Water. While that project is only 9 months into a roughly 5-year construction period, and we're just completing the pilot, we did see the promise of that technology at a couple levels. One, we did employ our portal. Our project includes a portal where customers can get information on their water use data, but also a way that we can push out information to our customers. And we employed that portal for the first time in this event. It wasn't quite ready to be deployed in that way, but we focused and decided to launch on it. And I think we got some good results. It clearly needs some more work as we implement the project, but we'll share that with you today. Also, in the few thousand meters we have installed, we were able to gather already insights into how customers were using water during the event, how much water was being used to drip faucets in certain homes. And that, I think, will help us shape our communication and our messages in the future as we're in these kind of events. And also how we can better tell who's in water and who's out of water. Right now, with our analog system and the water piping network, it's very difficult for us to tell individual homes or neighborhoods if they're in or out of water. And that's going to start to change in the future as we have more AMI and we build out the data network and can have more devices communicating through that network. Water is much different than power in the sense that it's heavy. Every gallon of water weighs over 7 pounds. We have to have the water move through the system at only 2 to 4 feet a second. It's difficult to tell if water's leaking out through a break or leak. Elevation is very important on water and water service availability. Your neighbor could have water, and if you live up on the hill, you may be hours or days away from getting water to your location. And we'll go into that a little more for you today. But there are important water dynamics that are different than energy and other utilities that we would seek understanding from the council. In closing my opening remarks, I would say as we work together to examine what happened and how we move forward, it's important on the water side to consider more than just water, more than at least the public water system. I think as you're all experiencing with your own constituents, there were tens of thousands of private water infrastructure failures in this event. We'll spend more time analyzing that data, and to the degree we can understand it all. But between our responses, Austin Fire responses, and others, there's clearly tens of thousands of buildings that experienced burst pipes, burst fire lines, burst water heaters. And it's very difficult to keep the public system going when you experience tens of thousands of private infrastructure failures. And I think that's an important part of our examination is what were the contributing causes to all of that private infrastructure? How might plumbing codes change in the future to reduce that risk? How did the grid outage affect that? Having so many homes be without power for so long, having the temperature in those homes drop to very low levels, I think is something that needs to be examined in terms of how that may have contributed and how we would work through that in the future. So a lot of miles to go. I just wanted to give you an overview, I think, of some of those areas, and with that, I would turn it over now to our Chief Operating Officer, Assistant Director Rick Coronado.
Good afternoon, Council, Committee Chair. We have quite a bit of material that we want to go over. If you can go to the next slide. I'm Rick Coronado, Assistant Director for Operations, and I'll kind of go over the overview of the system as well as the timelines. We're going to also dive into some communications, but I want to give you a sense of the overview of the system to understand how the distribution works and also what we experience over the storm event. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar with Austin's design for the treatment and the distribution system, this here is to illustrate how water is moved throughout the city. It's intended to kind of be a graphic of not only the zones that you may have seen through some of our publications, but also how water is moved from the lake systems all the way to our highest elevations. And so we have these named here as different zones, starting from the lowest elevation near the Lake Austin, which is the central zone. That's going to be the lowest zone in which our two treatment plants, both Ulrich and Davis, feed into and pump into. The illustrations also try to depict also the storage capacity. As you get into the higher elevations, we have some storage capacities that range anywhere from the largest system of our tanks is a 34 million gallon tank, which is the Martin Hill, to some of our smallest reservoirs, which we call water storage tanks, that are maybe less than 1 million gallons. So that varies from location to location, but this helps kind of identify areas of the south and also areas of the north. One difference is that we also pull from Lake Travis, in which the Hancock's water treatment plant is at a higher elevation. It also will feed into the Northwest A zone. This is important to understand as we kind of go into in comparison to the geography. Each one of these color codes also will be represented in the next map, which I will show you in a second. But I want to also point out that we have 9 major pressure zones. We have over 40 plus pump stations, and our storage capacity for the entire city is around 150 million gallons. One thing to also note is we have significant transmission pipelines that go to each one of these reservoirs from each pump station. And that is probably equivalent to the amount of storage that we have above ground as we do underground. So as much volume as you have above ground, we have piping volume that is equivalent below ground. So that'll factor into kind of diagnosing what may have been experienced throughout this event. Next slide, please. So you may be familiar with the system map. This was utilized over the course of the event to kind of help communicate where in the city we had pressure, where we had outages, where you fell in relationship to these pressure zones. So each pressure zone here is depicted by a different color, starting with the central zone being in green. That is one of our largest pressure zones. And the south is color-coded in blue, as well as the north is color-coded in blue. Those represent similar hydraulic grade line elevations, similar to kind of a level of the water level as you get higher and higher in elevation. We have also the Southwest A, B, and C. Those are kind of in comparison to Northwest A, B, and C. And if you recall, during the outages, the extremities were the first to kind of experience water outages, and we'll go through that shortly in a timeline. One other thing I want to point out is that there was concern about understanding how many folks or individuals were out of water. That's a kind of right now a very difficult task because we don't have individual metering points to identify whether or not you have water or not. We have the tank elevations, pressure indicators, but one thing we can't determine at this point, which we will be able to once we roll out a full citywide AMI, is where in the city individuals will have water and where they will not. That is one area that we are going to continue to grow in to identify outages. What we do know is that we can identify how many customers and also meters are located in each one of these zones. And these are major zones. But each one of these areas also have separate zones in between or within these zones. For example, someone who lives in the south zone may have not experienced any water outage because they are in a low-lying area, maybe a reduced south zone. So there's even variations in some of these major zones. So that's the complexity of trying to understand the outages that would have occurred. Next slide, please. So I want to give you kind of a timeline overview. And I want to kind of spend a little time just kind of putting out the descriptions that you may see in front of you. The red solid line represents storage. Storage is kind of the indicator of how much capacity you have in the stored water tanks. This was a similar graph that you may have seen in communications. The blue pin represents the usage pattern. The usage pattern that's calculated once an hour. The green pin represents the production, how much was sent into the system, and the usage is really a calculation of what is your storage change over that hour. It's kind of a water balance that we calculate on an hourly basis. So the other point I want to make on this graphic is the brackets on the freezing temperatures and the beginning and the end, which represents about an 8-day period of low temperatures overnight. That will factor into a later graph in which we will see the amount of leaks that we experience over the course of this event. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the initial storm response. Prior to the storm event and the overnight freezes, we had experienced some events that I highlighted here. Lakewood transmission main break on February the 10th, about 1 p.m. That is a spike of about maybe 15 million gallons plus of water usage. That is a 48-inch transmission main that failed before the event. That kind of gives you an indication that we, on occasion, will experience some of these large water loss events, but the system is capable of recovering in a short period of time. The red indicated that there was no storage reduction during that time, but that is just one single event. And so as you kind of walk through this sequence of events, I want you to keep in mind what may transpire when you have multiple leaks throughout the city. The next bullet and capture that I have there is, because of that Lakewood transmission event, we put our Austin Water Incident Command on standby, which meant that we were in situational awareness identifying some of the needs that we would have to ensure that are met should something arise during the situational awareness period. One of the other things I want to kind of point out is during this time frame, preparations occurred from anywhere from scheduling changes, getting our fleet prepared, identifying what will be our workloads over the course of the next week as the temperatures may increase. It is not uncommon for us to have 1 to 2 day freeze events. We kind of adjust our schedule, prepare our staff on how to work safely in some of these extreme weather conditions. We also kind of prepare for what is the incident command schedule over time. Those are things that normally will happen, including some of the facility preparations that include freeze protection of certain pipe equipment. We have a lot of chemicals and feed equipment at our treatment plants, and they're susceptible to freezing just as any other outdoor piping. So there's quite a bit that has to go in preparation for any storm event. This is still pre-storm event, but one of the initial incidents that we experienced with a power outage was a sanitary sewer overflow on the 12th. This was probably one of the first things we were working through during the event was sanitary sewer overflows. We probably experienced anywhere from 20 outages of lift stations throughout the city, in which 10 of those were restored fairly quickly. Of the remainder, we had to either pump and haul, make sure that we were cycling trucks to go to the locations and pump out the sanitary sewer lift stations, and then continue that pattern until we either got a temporary generator or if we had full power restoration. So that was in addition to, some of the other permanent and temporary generators that we were relocating throughout the city. So once power got restored, we mobilized that generator and took it to another lift station. So we continued to do that for quite a few days through this event. Currently, we still have temporary power and controls for this lift station that took probably the largest amount of damage through this storm. Let's see. Other types of preparation included coordination with Austin Energy, because we are on the critical load list, and understanding that that's a very good partnership to make sure that our facilities are in power during some of these potential brownouts or blackouts. So that is a critical part to understand who to contact with Austin Energy key accounts. Another area that I'll just focus on briefly is that we did have to tend to Longhorn Dam with the power outage during this time frame and ensure that we had coordination with LCRA as they also activated the emergency operations, and we're also going to be generating hydroelectric electricity. Next slide, please. So this is going to be probably one of the busiest call outs that we have during this time frame. And this is the phase in which we lost water storage. In advance of the boil water, citywide boil water, we had a sequence of events that occurred on the 16th. The 16th was probably the first indication. That was when the Southwest B, if you recall the map, the geography is southwest area of Austin, was the first area to experience a water outage. And normally when we get calls, the elevation that's the highest will experience a water outage. and we'll respond to that. If we recover the system, that doesn't necessarily indicate that that's a boil water requirement. One of the things that occurred during that evening and overnight was that as we tried to replenish the system, some of the challenges that the not only distribution system maintenance staff as well as the pump stations and reservoir staff experienced was freezing of maybe level indicators, where we had to go out and physically look and see what was the level, what was the pressure, what was the readings. At the same time, if there were any leaks that were occurring, some of them were masked through the weather conditions, and so there was a lull in maybe some of the leaks that may have occurred. Another factor that could have played is that during this time frame, there are two patterns of water usage. There's a morning peak and an evening peak. The evening peak would have coincided with a potential outage in the Southwest B area. This would be typically, the peak may extend from anywhere from 8 to 10 p.m. at night, and where usage demand is the heaviest. This is what the Southwest B experienced. We then started plans to activate the Department Operations Center and activate Incident Command. And so by AM, the next shift that came in was already in an Incident Command structure from the team that was already established, and that started the process of activating the Department Operations Center. Overnight, there still was planning because there was no way to identify how many individuals were out of water, other than what I've estimated is we have a number of connections and meters per zone. And so we were already in process to start the planning and the notice for the Southwest B water notice, or boil water notice. In addition to the Southwest B, the power at Lost Creek went out during that time frame. We have what we call hydropneumatic systems, which do not involve water tanks and water storage. They're a combination of pressure and water. We pressurize the system, and that is how the community in that area for some of the hydropneumatic zones receive their water. With the power outage, we had to try to get a generator out there, but we had depleted the zone of any water, so that was also on the list to have a boil water notice as well. So that those occurrences transpired into the Southwest B and Lost Creek boil water notice about 11 a.m. About the time that was happening, we achieved a peak demand. If you the diurnal morning peak demand of over 330 million gallons achieved. So that was an indication that there was something that was extremely high in whether it was leaks being generated through public or private piping. That will, that's something that we'll have to dig through some of our records and the after action, but that is an indicator that something in the system has gone wrong, meaning that there are leaks that we cannot identify and get to, or the private side experienced a large amount of water loss during that time frame. Shortly after that peak event and the Southwest B boil water notice, about 2 p.m., that is when Ulrich's power went out. And as Mr. Marzales mentioned, that is an event that occurred about 2 p.m. we were not able to start the process, at least the first phase of the process, to about 5:30. So with travel time, it took electricians that were attending to some of the lift station outages about an hour and 15 minutes to arrive. They assessed the system with some of the system operators and started to restore the plant back within an hour's time. The first electrical startup then starts the checks and balances for all the chemical feed systems and all the reactors that we have to mix those chemicals to produce drinking water. So that took several hours before we could get the first level of production. That night, we were able to get Ulrich back to about the same level of production that they were prior to the outage, so about 1 a.m. that morning. With the depressurization of the storage, that triggered the citywide boil water notice. We were already facing a kind of a dire situation with the demand peak at 9 a.m. and the storage dropping considerably in a very short period of time. So that kind of gave an indication that there were some leaks that we could not identify, and that'll kind of become a little more clear in the leak demand graph that we'll show in briefly. The citywide boil water notice was issued that evening, and that kind of started the process of how to recover the system from some of the central zones to the outer outskirts of the system. Let's see. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So this here is system recovery. There's many factors that play into how to recover a system once you have depressurized it. One of the things that we have to ensure is that we have enough adequate pressure, not only for fire flow protection, but also for safety reasons and adequate flow to our customers to sustain it. We did have to work with some of the critical customers, our hospitals in the central zone and eventually our south and north zones, to try to get them water as quickly as possible by transferring some of these pipelines to them more directly. And so by doing so, we were able to sustain the central zone and some of the critical customers that were in the central zone. And this was one of the first areas that was lifted from the boil water. We had multiple conversations with TCEQ in which they approved this type of plan to kind of resend the boil water in pressure zone stages, with central zone being the first. That was the first one we were able to establish. Then north, south, and northwest A were the next ones to be reestablished. Then finally, the remainder of the zones were able to lift the entire citywide boil water notice. Some of the things that we also had to do was ensure that we took bacteriological and chlorine residual tests throughout to ensure that the water was safe to drink. But those all came clear, which allowed us to phase this rapidly in a short period of time from the central zone to the citywide. Otherwise, we would have had to wait for all of the tests to come back, but this was our way to adapt how to get the system back to recovery. One of the things that we also made a point was we kept communicating what safety or safe levels of our storage look like. And so we were trying to target and achieve at least 100 million gallons of storage throughout the city. And some areas definitely achieved that sooner than others. On the final note there, the emergency water restrictions were lifted on the 24th, subsequent the boil water notice being lifted. I also want to point out that some of the things that we experienced, obviously, with the data being relying on tank levels. If you go back one slide, please. One of the things that I want to point out is that when we reach the bottom of the storage levels, which was coincidentally about the same time we were able to recover Ulrich water treatment plant to full production prior to the outage, is that once a tank goes out of water, then the pipeline becomes the next volume to work with. And so I mentioned that there's about the same amount of volume above ground as there is below ground. And so one of the things that we will go through in this after action is identify how much water we did lose, because we had to replenish the pipelines before you could replenish the tanks. And so the reason why you see such a gradual climb is because we were refilling the pipelines before you could fill the tanks themselves. Next slide, please. Okay. Thank you. I wanted to share with you some of the preliminary information that we have gathered here. This represents the timeline, the event sequences, as well as a comparison of some of the leak and leak demands that we saw throughout this event. The bar chart on the bottom represents leak demands that include not only mains, but also services and other types of leaks that are major. The first indicator that we had some surface of major mains probably didn't surface itself until about the 16th. Then on the 17th, there was a drop in the number of main breaks. On the 18th, we had an uptick of about 17 main breaks, the 19th of 30, and then 23, 26, 12, and so forth. Now, just because that's when they surface doesn't necessarily mean that's when they when the actual main leaked. Because the conditions didn't materialize where you could see some of these main breaks, they could have initiated during the 17th, or at least a portion of those may have initiated during the 17th. This is important because as we kind of look to some of the lessons learned and improvements, is trying to invest in not only AMI, but also some of the smart grid tools that help us identify leaks throughout the system, including pressure management as well as leak detection for the future. I think that will help us also drive improvements in understanding where areas of town may be experiencing more leaks than others. One of the things that we also have identified during this analysis is that about 90% of these leaks were related to cast iron pipes. They were the most brittle during this time frame, and it was very similar to what other utilities experienced as well. So that is an area of improvement that we will be looking at to ensure that how do we work through an event like this with some of the pipeline materials that we have. And so as we dive into some of that information and find the failure modes, we will look to see how we can enhance our capital improvement plans as well. With that, I'll turn it over to communications.
That's Randy Jenkins, please. If you could have Assistant Director Jenkins become a participant.
Thank you, Director Mazzaros. I'm with you all. Good afternoon, Mayor, Council, and Committee Chair. As mentioned and noted, I am Randy Jenkins, Assistant Director for Austin Water, and I'll be providing an overview of our communications today. So now that Assistant Director Coronado has been able to acclimate you to the systematic overview of this winter weather event, I wanted to overlay and shed some light on what occurred as we maneuvered through this event and how we adjusted our messaging throughout. And so we've remained keeping the systematic map in front of you so that you can kind of have an idea as we walk through the days throughout this event. So starting with our communications, it really began before the event initiated. So even before the winter weather hit us on February 9th, we started pushing communications on cold weather preparedness, protecting plants, pipes, and pets. We also issued tips on our website, and we also issued a press release formalizing that notification to the media, which the media did pick up and publicly run stories about cold weather preparations. Moving into the 12th, when we started to begin to see the freezing weather and the sleet and the wind pick up, and as power outages increased, we continued our frozen pipe messaging. And then as Assistant Director Coronado indicated, we did have a sewage overflow that initiated on that day. And so we did provide public notice of that sanitary sewer overflow. And then moving into February 13th and 14th, we continued our pipe protection messaging and how to locate your water shutoff valve for private property owners, so that they knew if they experienced a leak or a break where they could cut water service so that their homes were not further damaged. Moving into February 15th, as conditions continue to worsen, we also had to engage our Longhorn Dam operations, as Director Mazzaros mentioned. And so we had to push messaging out to our key stakeholders regarding those operations. We also then turned our attention to asking the public, as we started to see water use spike, to conserve and avoid the use of large appliances in their homes. And then moving into the 16th, as communities around us and neighboring utilities began to issue their own boil water notices, we did a lot of heavy lifting and effort around tamping rumors down so that our utility customers were aware that we had not yet issued a boil water notice, and we continued to provide those frozen pipe instructions, and that at this time, Austin Water had adequate water to serve our customers. Next slide, please. And so moving into the heart of the event, into the 17th, which Assistant Director Coronado indicated that's when we saw the pressures drop below minimum level and issued our boil water notice for the Southwest area and Lost Creek community. We issued mandatory water conservation notices and pushed out messaging in that way. We also held our first of several virtual news conferences, and by 8:30 p.m. that evening on the 17th, we had issued our press release and public notice regarding the citywide boil notice. And I'll get into in some of my later slides exactly how we communicated some of that citywide and other efforts in more detail in a moment. On Thursday, February 18th, our water treatment plant still at that time were operating in somewhat stable mode. And so we were pushing out that information, but still encouraging our customers to boil their water, including messages in other languages such as Spanish, Vietnamese, Chinese, and Arabic. And then again, held another virtual news conference and continued our conservation messaging. In the early morning hours of February 19th, we began to produce our daily operations update that continued throughout the event, where we would update our website and all of our outlets twice a day so that we could continue to keep the public abreast of what was going on with Austin Water and their utility service. We held another virtual press conference and did indicate at that time we were starting to see improvements in our system, and we're hopeful that we would be able to pull through this towards the end of the weekend. By Saturday, February 20th, We continue to call for conservation, and for those that were starting to receive water back in their homes in the outer areas of our service area, we did provide instructions for flushing pipes as individuals came back into service. And at that same time and day, we did issue our emergency water use restrictions as we were hearing concerns in the community about car washes starting to open up as our temperature started to climb. And we, I believe, on that day had our first sunny day. Moving into Sunday, February 21st, we started to promote our water distribution sites that were set up for public that were still experiencing water outages due to their own private side plumbing breaks, and continued to push out frequently asked questions for water and flushing pipe, and also reminders to keep water boiling, because at that time we had still not lifted fully citywide. An additional item to note, we also participated with some of you. Our Assistant Director, Anna Bryan Borhall, did join some of you in some of your Facebook Live events so that we could directly communicate with your constituents on the fly as the event unfolded. So Monday, next slide, please. So as Monday morning, February 22nd, we were able to partially lift our boil water notice for the central pressure zone. And as Assistant Director Coronado mentioned, that was the lowest level of our pressure zone and nearest to our largest treatment plants that were able to have water restored first. And as we moved water throughout the outer edges of our system, and then we launched on that same day an interactive map, knowing that we needed to give the public some direct insight into exactly what pressure zone they resided in. We launched that day. We did have a few outages on that map as the website was flooded. We had over 1.2 million hits on that map, which was great. That means that it was working and people were utilizing it, but we certainly know that that is something to look at, better beef up our infrastructure on our website to support that effort. We also started to hear rumors and get information about scams that were occurring about repairs to water system and on the private side. And so we pushed out some scam alert messaging to make sure that our customers knew when and how Austin Water would be communicating them and when it was a legitimate outreach for them to respond to. By Tuesday, February 23rd, the boil water notice was lifted for all customers, and the mandatory water use restrictions, remained in place. And so we issued the press release and issued notification through our Warren Central Texas messaging, which is also referred to as Reverse 911, as well as our My ATX Water portal, utilizing the text message and email alert system. And again, we'll get into that in a few minutes about how that exactly works. And so as we pulled out of the boil water notice, we maintained the mandatory water use restrictions through the 24th, and again, began to promote emergency repair resources for our residents and began messaging for our apartment and condo residents throughout the Austin area. Next slide, please. And so a high-level overview of our communication activities and strategies. As I mentioned at the onset of this event, we began social channels monitoring and responses throughout, starting on February 9th, as we were beginning to hear reports of the winter weather advisories. And so we then certainly moved forward into media coordination. We issued 10 news releases during this entire event, starting with preparedness messaging and then cold weather tips issued on February 10th. We provided media representation and stayed in constant contact with media, answering questions and scheduling interviews throughout. We also held a series of virtual news conferences, and Austin Water participated in 4 of those. And then as I highlighted our Warren Central Texas and customer portal notifications, just to give a highlight of exactly how many notifications went out using both of those systems. So through the My ATX Water portal, and I believe Director Mazzaros mentioned this in his briefing, that this is our pilot portal and a part of our pilot project that we're launching. And so we never thought that we would need to utilize it in this way, but we're certainly glad that we had it. we were able to send approximately 175,000 text messages at a time. And we did that 3 times over. So just north of 552,000 text messages were sent through that portal. We duplicated that effort via email as well. And so when we first started hearing and learning of outages and our boil water notice in the Southwest area, we initiated that portal message. And then secondly, when we issued the citywide boil notice, and then when those boil notice, the citywide boil notice was lifted. And so one of the issues, and I believe it was brought up in an earlier discussion, that we experience with our portal and are already digging into what we can do to prevent this in the future. But one of the issues was the time lag that it took once we geared up the portal to send out that notification, that it took many hours to get those text messages sent out through that portal. And so we've already contacted the vendor, and the vendor indicated that we were not the only utility utilizing their system here in Texas that experienced that delay in chugging through those text messages to get them out citywide. And so there was a time gap between the time in which we issued the citywide boil water notice to the time that maybe that last customer on the list of, the 175,000 received that last text message. So we are aware of that time lag, and we are already digging into that activity and how we can beef that system up. On the Warren Central Texas side, Austin Water, we worked in partnership with HESM to send alerts through the reverse 911 system. Approximately 1.2 million contacts are in that database, and that consists of phone numbers, email addresses, and cell phone numbers for text messaging. And so that messaging system was utilized in the same manner at the onset of the citywide boil water notice and at the conclusion of that event when it was rescinded. And so as I mentioned throughout the timeline, we once we stood up the operational updates, including the interactive map, we were updating that multiple times throughout the day. And then we kept a robust FAQs and language translation documents so that the public could access those. And we continue to refine and build on those FAQs throughout the event as additional questions cropped up from council offices, as well as questions that came in through public means. And so lastly, I'll highlight our online forms. So originally, when a homeowner or customer experiences an outage or any kind of problem with their utility service, we encourage them to contact our customer service line, our dispatch line, which ultimately I kind of like to refer to it as our 911 for utilities. And with the high number of calls that were coming in, that system failed on several times throughout this event. And so we stood up the online forum to give people a direct link to communicate with us with what they were experiencing. And then we set up through not only Austin Water volunteers, but a series of volunteers throughout the City of Austin organization to conduct outbound calls and follow up on those online forms that were submitted. And so throughout that event, we conducted over 2,000 outbound calls from these volunteers, in addition to what was provided through our dispatch phone line.
Thank you. So this is a great overview. We really appreciate this, and we appreciate the level of detail that you all just went into for us. We're going to pause now and take some questions. We have until we could push it to 3:25 or 3:30 at the most to take questions before we turn to the last part, which is the financial relief plan and the support for community recovery. So I'm going to ask that each of you only ask one question and one follow-up, and please be brief so that we give everyone as much opportunity to ask questions as we can. And we know, of course, this is not the last opportunity. So we'll start with Councilmember Ellis.
Thank you, Councilmember Kitchen. I'm going to do my best to follow those rules because I know I have a lot of questions, but everybody does. So the system overview map that you were able to share in these slides was extremely helpful for explaining why a district like mine and possibly Councilmember Kelly's districts were early offline and last to resume pressurization. Sorry, I have a hard time breathing because my injuries I'm dealing with. But also your map says the boil water notice was issued more than 12 hours after my first constituents were offline. And so a lot of them had been without power or water for a very long time before getting a boil water notice. Why wasn't there earlier communication for those families who came offline very early and really didn't have even any emergency operations water supplied to them for drinking or for plumbing until Sunday? So can you tell me about those first 12 hours and where the lack of communication was on why we were first off and last on?
I can start. So as Rick communicated, when we were experiencing the start of the event, there was some unknowns. Were the tanks really emptying? Was it instrumentation issues? How bad was the area? We had also thought in that first night that there might be a bad main break southwest that we were going to repair and the system would be restored. And so there was a lot of just unknowns before we would be in a position to issue the boil water notice. We wanted to make sure that it was truly the system had depleted to the point of a boil water notice. And then there's some logistics of boil water notice, of writing up the notice and exactly what extent it would apply to, which areas, how do we communicate the geographic bounds of that. I think some other issues we were wrestling with is the last time we issued boil water notice, it created a bit of a run on water. Is that the system would very rapidly start seeing demand increases as people were filling bathtubs and others. And we were trying to kind of prepare for that. So I think it was a sequence of events of kind of just the fog of war, trying to ascertain what was truly happening, as well as preparing for writing the event, issuing it, and having support for the customers as they were experiencing boil water notice.
And so then can you help me understand, once it was understood that parts of Southwest Austin were completely offline, there should be a place where people can go similar to the energy outage map to try to figure out, is it on the radar? You have a leak map with Austin Water that is very good about information that what's been reported. Where is it in the system? Has it been investigated? Has it been repaired? What's the deal? But when it came to water outage, at first it was stagnant graphics, and then it became an ArcGIS thing that we were able to share with people. But the pressurization, the system overview slide you shared today would have been really helpful 2 weeks ago for people to understand where their neighborhood was on that scale, and therefore what the expectations are, because we're very resilient in Southwest Austin. We can take care of ourselves. We will take care of ourselves. We just need to know how to plan. And a lot of my constituents felt like they were left, quite honestly, in the dark. And by the time that boil water notice came out, people were almost smiling. So they said, "What water? What boiling?" Like we are hours behind that situation. So that system overview map with the pressurization is really something that could have been helpful 2 weeks ago for people who were trying to take care of each other.
Councilmember, your criticisms are right on, exactly. I think that's the things we've got to get better at and make interactive maps and other tools a regular everyday business that we have. And we're not trying to create it or invent it in the emergency. We need to have them running every day, and as we experience different events, they're just automatically updated. That is a gap that we had, and we had to invent some of it on the fly, and there were lags, and that's, I think, part of the after action is getting better there and making sure that they can scale up. As Randy indicated, when we did get our interactive map, it was very popular, 1.5 million hits in a day, and so we have to make sure those systems are also scalable. I hear what you're saying.
I've got one last follow-up, and then, Chair, I promise I'll be done, unless there's extra time at the end. But you had mentioned being able to provide more protection for the critical infrastructure and working with TCEQ. Were any of those actions, meaning that other parts of town were going to be delayed. Is that playing into the delay with some of my district getting water back on?
I'll answer that. No, what it did is prioritize those critical infrastructures within a pressure zone. So obviously the first zone that had pressure was central. And so what we did is redirected and make sure they stayed with water. And so that was one of the first things that we did to try to alter how to fill the tanks. So one of the things that we were experiencing is if we didn't redirect them to the tanks, which in the diagram, you move the water to the next level tanks. And so that's what we were trying to do, is redirect them to the next level of tanks. So that way we can move water even further out in the further reaches versus lose them through some leaks that we just hadn't identified yet. So it actually served as a dual purpose.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification. I have more questions, but I will let others have a chance.
Thank you, Councilmember Ellis. We have other questions for this part. Councilmember Alter, and then the mayor after Councilmember Alter.
Thank you. I have a lot of questions. Let me
Well, of course,
focus on. Do you want to do it on the? Do you want us to focus on the timeline first, or I have plant questions?
Well, Councilmember Alter, it's fine, but remember, one question with one follow-up.
I understand that. I was just going to say that I just wanted to get a sense if we wanted us to stay on the timeline type questions or if it mattered.
Whatever we've covered so far, it's up to you.
Okay, great. So I have a lot of questions. I posted many on the message board. I want to, for now though, dig down into kind of understanding how we seemingly had a crisis in the blink of an eye. We were being told one day that we had no concerns about the water system whatsoever, to boil water and no supply. So I'd like to know what did Austin Water know and when did they know it with respect to the loss of water pressure?
So let me start off with the timeline. What Austin Water experienced where there was some concerns about water loss was during the night of the 16th, which is when the Southwest B first experienced a water outage. Within 12 hours, the demand did not decrease. It actually exceeded in every zone throughout the city by a factor of 2.5. So normally during this time frame, the average water use throughout the city is about 120 million gallons a day. That exceeded even some of our summertime peaks, well over 250 sustained. And so that is when we started seeing that we could not, even with our production plants, we could not sustain that level. In addition to that, we could not see or identify any leaks that were in the system that we could go shut off. The amount of leaks that tapered off on the 17th were lower than what we had experienced the day before that we were already addressing. And then we had another spike as the weather started to clear up as far as road conditions after the 17th. So we do have some voids in what information we could collect during that time frame, but the tanks were the indicator that kind of fell off on level in a very short period of time once we also had no additional pumpage for a short, brief time.
So then if we knew it on the 16th that there were potential supply issues, it's my understanding that we didn't start with the conservation messaging until this Thursday. Why was there such a long delay in that messaging if the public could have helped with conservation messages for the storage?
Councilmember, I'll answer that in part here. So, our emergency conservation is really focused on outdoor water, that irrigation, cooling, power washing, and that the water use that we were incurring during the first part of this was indoor water, toilet flushing, washing, those kind of things. So it didn't strike us early on in the event that we would issue a conservation mandate, given that, the system was behaving up until Tuesday night and into it. I think, again, we were struggling. The last time we issued mandatory conservation, water use soared. It had the opposite effect. And that was during the 2018 boil water notice. When we started to issue conservation messages, it had the opposite effect, that it went really high. I mean, the mayor might remember that when we were appealing to him to get on the media and please encourage to truly take conservation seriously. So we were anxious about issuing some conservation and creating a panic on water. And I think you could look back and say, that was the wrong move or the right move. I don't know. It's one of the things we'll want to talk through some more. I think even, from conservation, in the early part of the event and through the first few days, we were encouraging people to drip their faucets. That's a traditional technique the utility has encouraged to keep from having a private pipe burst. And I think one of the lessons of an extended, 5+ day cold period is we can't do that, or we're going to have to do it differently. Or one of the other data points we're looking at is how much water flowed at our wastewater plants, and the indication is there was a lot of water flowing into our wastewater plants, which shows that I think the dripping was creating a lot of water demand. And we're in a tough spot. Did I want to issue a conservation call and say, don't drip your water, knowing that might lead to all kinds of burst pipes? There was just not a lot of good choices. And that was some of the dynamic that was going on.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Alter, do you have just one more short question?
Yeah, I would like Director Mazzaros to answer my question about how we kind of got into a crisis in the blink of an eye and his explanation for that.
Well, I think Rick hit on it. If you go back to the graphs, with the start of the event and the freezing on Friday and into Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and even the day Tuesday, the first 4 or 5 days of that, we did not see a sign that the water demand or storage was going to deplete the way it did. Really, from the evening, Saturday night, roughly at 10, I may not have the exact time right, into Wednesday morning and Wednesday day is when the storage totally depleted. It was roughly a 12-hour period that we went from storage being mostly okay to empty. And Rick could probably elaborate a little more specifically on that. He's more familiar with some of the graphs, but it happened very, very rapidly. It was, I don't know, that's one of the things we'll want to understand is why the system ultimately deteriorated so rapidly in roughly a 12 to 24-hour period.
Okay, thank you. So, Mayor, did you want to go next?
Mayor, you're muted.
You're muted, Mayor.
I recall that at the time, the water depleted so quickly you didn't believe that it was necessarily true, and had it physically checked because it was being depleted so rapidly. The question I have for you that I'd like to ask is, there were media reports about ORIC, and we were ready to turn it on, but we didn't have people out at the plant that knew how to do that. Can you speak to those media reports, and is that true? And tell us about that.
Yeah, I'll start and have Rick add in, but we did issue a more detailed summary of our response to the loss of power at Ulrich. And so each council member would have gotten a more detailed summary of some of the steps that occurred with the loss of power and then the response. So a couple things. We did have our electricians were in the field responding to lift stations. And so there was some need to call them back and bring them to Ulrich to check the internal electrical systems and manipulate the switch gear and do the other kind of checks when we lose power. So that was a delay, not having electricians at the plant out in the field attending to the power losses at the lift stations. And as I indicated in my introduction, when we experience a total power loss at a large plant, we have to go through a series of startup again with the plant. And Rick, I think you're probably better to articulate what that requires on a startup of a plant after a power loss.
Sure, I'll add to, just as you described, as our lift station activities rerouted our electricians. We had sheltered in place all our mechanics and operators, and we may have had even instrumentation staff on site working through operating the plant. But as a significant power outage like this, everything kind of goes dark, and you have not only just minimal flood lighting, but also you start looking to see if there's any equipment that has failed, because it's a surge on the system. So it's a surge in the plant that you have to make sure that things don't rupture, that once they get re-energized, they go through a systematic checks that not only are you looking at pumping systems, but chemical systems. You have a lot of safety chemical feed systems that you have to ensure are adequately operating. So it's a joint effort between the electrician, staff, maintenance, instrumentation, mechanics. And so we had just about all the disciplines there except the electricians, which were en route and took about an hour and 15 to get there, and then have to go through and suit up with their protective gear to turn on or switch the power controls to the available power. And so at the time that they were doing that, the second feed also came up from Austin Energy. So simultaneously, we were able to produce somewhere around 5:30 our first production of water that safely will go into the public. So we had staff, but not the right discipline on site.
Thank you, Mayor. Did you have a follow-up, Mayor? Okay. All right, we're going to move on now to our next area. And I know that people have a lot more questions, and I appreciate that, but we need to move on at this point to the financial relief plan for customers. So if you all want to move to that, Councilmember Tocco, I will, if we have some time, we will return to you. We need to move on to the bill relief right now. So go ahead.
We do have an opportunity to talk about that. It's on council's agenda tomorrow. So that would be another opportunity to talk about the bill relief, I think.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
That's fine. I was suggesting that the bill relief for Austin Energy and for Austin Water is also on council's agenda tomorrow. So that would be another opportunity to talk about it.
Right, but we have quite a bit of information that's going to be shared with us now about bill relief. So we'll go to that and then we'll come back if we have time. So if you all want to turn to that and make your presentation there.
Joseph Gonzalez, our Chief Financial Officer, will provide the overview.
Good afternoon, Council. Again, my name is Joseph Gonzalez, Austin Water Assistant Director over Financial Services, and I'll be providing a brief overview of our proposed financial relief efforts in response to the February winter storm event. Now, we recognize the hardships and stress that our customers and our community experienced as a result of the storms, and our goal is to avoid adding any additional stress for our customers who are worried about potential high bills as a result of dripping faucets and burst pipes. So to that end, we'll be seeking council approval tomorrow for various bill relief initiatives to help mitigate high bills resulting from the winter storm event. First, we are recommending temporary residential rate relief that would reduce volumetric rates for tiers 3 through 5 to 1 cent per thousand gallons, and also reduce the tiered fixed fee for those same tiers 3 through 5, the tier 2 rate of $3.55. Now, the proposed rate reductions would essentially cap residential bills at 6,000 gallons of consumption. In addition, we're proposing that Austin Water be granted authority to apply bill adjustment credits to retail customers whose water consumption was impacted by the winter storm event. While City Code currently allows Austin Water to apply leak adjustments and high bill adjustments to residential customers, it does not provide for similar adjustments for multifamily or commercial customers. In addition, those adjustment policies require customers to formally submit bill adjustment requests with supporting documentation. And even with a normal volume of say 200 leak adjustment requests per month, it can take up to 2 billing cycles to process those adjustments and fully credit back customer accounts. So consequently, we're recommending that bill adjustments be expanded to include multifamily and commercial customers, and also that the documentation requirements be waived for customers impacted by the February winter storms. And we're also proposing that Austin Water be granted authority to modify the wastewater averaging methodology to use estimated consumption for the third month of the winter averaging period to ensure our customers are not unfairly penalized for high consumption that might have been caused by the winter storms. And then finally, in addition to the waiver of late fees that council approved last week, Austin Water is proposing that all emergency cutoff and cut-on fees be waived for customers impacted by the winter storms. Let's see, next slide, please. Now, we normally work very hard to avoid the use of estimated reads, particularly during months with higher levels of consumption, because during those months you risk pushing residential customers into the higher tiers of our inclining conservation-based rate structure when you ultimately get catch-up reads. But because we were unable to obtain customer reads for those bill cycles that were scheduled to read during the winter storm from February 15th through February 19th due to the dangerous road conditions and frozen meter boxes, we began using estimated reads for those customers that are based on each customer's historical usage patterns for those bill cycles. Now, we were able to resume reading meters last week on February 22nd. However, we are continuing to bill based on estimated reads to ensure that our customers receive bills based on their normal expected consumption levels while we work to implement our proposed high bill mitigation initiatives. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we're proposing a temporary rate reduction, which would be effective from March 19th through April 26th to reduce the volumetric rates and tiered fixed fees for the top 3 residential tiers. Now, that March 19th date coincides with the next scheduled read date for bill cycle 13, which was the first bill cycle that was billed using estimated reads, and then the temporary rates would be in effect until we get all the way back around to bill cycle 12, which was the last bill cycle billed with actual reads. So consequently, the catch-up consumption that's based on actual meter reads will all be pushed into that next billing cycle in March and April when the temporary rates are in effect. So any high residential consumption above 6,000 gallons would end up being billed at 1 cent per 1,000 gallons. Now, the hope is that these rate adjustments would virtually eliminate residential high bill requests that would likely have been submitted by our customers had they received bills for actual consumption during that period. And since almost 90% of our 247,000 customers are residential, anything that we can do to reduce the volume of residential leak adjustment requests would allow us to shift our resources to review multifamily and commercial accounts to identify any unusually high consumption levels among those customers, and then proactively apply leak adjustments to their accounts when we resume billing based on actual consumption. And then, as I mentioned earlier, The use of estimated reads for the current billing cycle will also allow us to replace potentially high consumption levels with normal expected levels of consumption for the final month of the wastewater averaging period to mitigate the impact of high consumption during the winter storm on the wastewater averaging calculations that are due to take effect, in April 1st for our customers. Now, however, while we will be reviewing actual read data to identify, again, potential leak adjustments, we'll also be reviewing wastewater averaging calculations to identify customer accounts whose water averaging calculation might be negatively impacted by the use of estimated reads, and then would adjust those accounts accordingly. Next slide, please. So this chart shows what we're trying to do from a residential rate perspective, in terms of dropping the tiered fixed fee and the volumetric rates for tiers 3 through 5, once again to essentially cap a residential customer's bill at 6,000 gallons. And you can see that under our normal rate structure, customers with leaks that push them into tiers 4 and 5, would be billed at significantly higher rates as a result of our inclining conservation-based rate structure without the proposed rate changes. So lowering these rates will allow us to avoid high bills going out for our residential customers, and again, in hopes of almost entirely eliminating the need for any kind of leak or high bill adjustment amongst our residential customers. And then the next slide will show the bill impact. So if we can move on to the next slide, the bill impact for a sample customer. Because the proposed rate changes begin at block 3, you can see that the bill for a customer using 6,000 gallons or less would be unchanged at $37.02 for a non-customer assistant or CAP customer assistance program, and would be unchanged at $17.36 for customers who are enrolled in our customer assistance program. But customers with high consumption caused by the winter storm would see a significant reduction in the bill under the temporary rates as compared to our current inclining conservation-based rate structure. So, for example, a non-cap customer with a leak that pushes consumption to 40,000 gallons, they would normally receive a bill for $510.22, while a cap customer would see a corresponding bill of $436.85. But under the proposed rates, those bills would be reduced by over 90% to $44.16 and $19.40 respectively. So you can see the impact of the proposed temporary rate structure as we try and push all of our residential consumption and potential high bills into those lower tier structures. And then next slide, please. So I'll conclude with quickly highlighting 2 other relief efforts that are being funded in part by Austin Water. Austin Water has committed $1 million in funding to support the Housing and Planning Department's Emergency Home Repair Initiative to help with customers who in need of plumbing repairs caused by the winter storm. In addition, a separate agenda item on tomorrow's council agenda will provide an additional $5 million each from Austin Water and Austin Energy for residential utility bill payment assistance through the Plus One program. Now, while demand for the Plus One payment assistance funding has increased dramatically during the pandemic, this assistance isn't limited to customers impacted by the pandemic. And that concludes, my overview of the bill relief efforts, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, so let's, if we could take the slides down, and then let's see, Vice Chair Fuentes, if you want to go first.
Thank you. So I guess my question is, well, 2 things. I just want to make clear I understand. We're asking, Austin Water is asking for council to waive the authority, or to include in the authority, individuals who live in apartments. And as we know, we've had several apartment complexes who've been without water, and still today, some are without water, have very little water dripping from their faucets. And so individuals who live in apartments would be eligible for these programs that you listed out here. And is that right?
That's correct. Multifamily customers, and remember, multifamily customers are master metered, and so they're not individually metered. So the bill would go to the complex or management company, but our plan is to expand the leak adjustment program to include those multifamily accounts and commercial accounts who would have experienced significant leaks or usage as a result of the winter storm event.
Is there any consideration, has Austin Water considered additional relief programs or assistance for individuals who live in multifamily units? Just looking at how the situation has rolled out and how the impact, disproportionate impact that many have received, have you all considered adding a fund specifically for individuals that reside?
Well, we recently, back in December, got council approval for a program to actually provide credits to customers of Austin Energy who reside in multifamily units, because as I mentioned earlier, because they're master metered, they're not an individual customer, and so historically we haven't had the ability to provide. We don't bill those customers directly, and so we haven't had the ability to provide any kind of customer assistance program support for those customers, because technically they weren't a direct Austin Water customer. But we're working to roll out a program that is scheduled to take effect next month that would provide customer assistance program customers in multifamily dwellings, $17 a month, credit on their electric bill, their overall utility bill, because that was a segment of our customers that we couldn't reach historically through the customer assistance program.
Yeah, it might be worth considering something additional, especially given the fact that many of us have now acquired our own lists of apartment complexes that have been without water. So we have a really good sense of individuals who have been affected. So perhaps there's an opportunity there to collaborate and figure out a way we can bring more immediate relief, to our neighbors in need.
Certainly, we can certainly brainstorm and look at other potential opportunities to provide relief to those customers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Anybody that hasn't asked a question? Okay, Councilmember Kassar, and then we'll go to Councilmember Ellis.
Just a clarifying question to make sure I understand the earlier slide. When you're saying you were going to use estimated reads for that month, does that mean that just I'm trying to understand the slide that has the dollar figures and the previous slide that you had mentioned. So that when you're saying we're going to use estimated reads for that month, does that just generally mean that for the period that folks were in the disaster, we're going to be billing them more or less on their usage in prior years as opposed to their usage this year?
That's correct. The billing system has an estimated consumption algorithm that looks at historical consumption, looks at prior month consumption. So the default is to default to the same period, in other words, February of last year, and would generate an estimate either based on February of last year, or for customers who haven't had that long of an account history, the prior month. And we're finding that generally speaking, prior month is probably the best estimate of current month consumption. And we're actually working to modify the billing system, I think, to use the preference of the prior month. But that's correct, that until the proposed rates are implemented, we would be sending out bills based on estimated consumption, unless we identify customers who had some kind of unusual activity in terms of the month that's being used to generate that estimated consumption.
Got it. So just generally, folks should expect that for the time of the disaster, they're going to be billed more or less the same amount as the prior month before the disaster. And then we'll
right. Correct. Either prior year consumption from last February or prior month, January consumption.
Got it. And then for the leak issue is more on a move forward basis, that if that leak persists into the next bill, that's what we're voting on, is addressing the rates for a potential leak that is still unaddressed.
Right. So because it'll take us a couple weeks to implement a rate change, we needed a little bit of time to ramp that up, and so the use of estimated reads will bias that time to avoid any high bills going out based on actual consumption. But it also will allow us to again push that consumption into that billing period, which is something, like I said, generally we avoid trying to do, but because we would be dropping the rates, it would be to their benefit to do that. It'll also allow us, buy us a little bit of time to do some more expansive, account review to proactively identify accounts that had significant impacts in terms of consumption and proactively make those adjustments.
I appreciate that, and just want to, before passing the baton here, just thank y'all for the work that I think has really accelerated here lately to create that centralized website and list of multifamily without water. Got confirmation from our city manager's office that today will really be at a place where, between the volunteer efforts and the city efforts, be getting water to all of those apartments that we have validated that don't have water. And I really appreciate that, between the city's effort and the volunteer effort, making sure that there is water delivery or a hydrant or a tote at each of those properties. And so I just wanted to acknowledge and appreciate that as we still deal with the ones that are persistent.
Thanks, Councilmember Cassar. We have one last item where we'll be talking more about the recovery.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's a good precursor to that. Before we turn to that, I think, Councilmember Ellis, did you have a question? And then Councilmember Alter about the bills, right? Go ahead, Councilmember Ellis.
Yes, I'm not trying to go back to the other one.
Okay.
So did I see that the estimate right now was that the new rate structure would end on April 26th? Is that a hard date, or is that something we can reassess? Since we know that some of the apartments are having a hard time really working through that with the just lack of plumbing supplies and availability.
Right, and that's another, I guess that's another benefit of trying to push the high levels of consumption into the next billing period, and because we do recognize that finding a plumber right now is very, very difficult. And generally speaking, the leak adjustment policy and the high bill adjustment policy that's currently written into city code allows for making adjustments for 2 billing cycles. We could expand, but we also recognize that we're heading into the irrigation season, so we wanted to try and push all of the consumption again into 1 billing cycle. But we feel like that the discretion that Director Mazzaros and Austin Water would be given in terms of applying bill adjustments for customers that were impacted by the storm event would actually extend beyond the dates that those rates are in effect. And so then we could maybe return to a more normal, if because I wasn't able to get it fixed immediately, my high levels of consumption went into April, that we could still address that with the authority that would be granted to apply leak adjustments even beyond the dates that the temporary rate reduction would be in effect.
That's helpful background. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Alter.
So in your example, you gave us the billing for somebody who had a leak versus a normal customer. How does this impact people who had no water supply for a week? Because if they have to pay the same water supply as they did last month, but they didn't use a month, does that have a material impact on their bill? Are
Well,
we,
so two things, that might be captured in the true up, when we get the normal read. And if, for example, they were billed, say for 5,000 gallons, but because of plumbing issues, they were out of water for an extended period of time, and the actual read is less than that, then it would trigger, I believe it would trigger a rebill that would true up and essentially credit for any consumption that was billed in excess of the actual read.
okay, so that comment just to help me understand something, I just want to repeat it to make sure that I'm understanding it.
Sure.
So essentially what we're doing is we're saying for this period, we're doing estimates, but we're going to read it next month. And then we're going to true it up next month. And the reason to put the billing set up like it is next month is that your leak may show up next month because you're being read then, but we're going to forgive that leak at that point when it's read. Is that the logic here?
Well, right. We understand that many of our customers, are going to be impacted by higher levels of consumption. And so we're trying to, again, push all of that consumption into the period where a bill would essentially be capped at the 6,000 gallon level. And so that's the hope.
But in terms of logistics, as I'm trying to understand it, is we're basically saying we're using an estimate for this month's bill. By next month, we'll be able to have reads, and we're going to true them up across your estimate and what we read at that point, and the value of the reduction at that point is because that's when we're going to be able to true it up for each of the customers, but we're not going to make you pay for more than 6,000 gallons even if you had a leak.
You're correct, Councilmember.
Correct.
We're only going to charge a penny per 1,000 gallons once you get above block 2 or into block 3, 4, and 5.
Okay, so I think that it would be helpful to have some additional messaging as we roll this out that we can explain to our constituents, because it's not immediately obvious why in the next period you'd have the reduction and how that helps them if their leak is resolved, but it has to do with when you're reading the meters and how you're using those meters over time. I'm not sure what the most appropriate messaging is, but it wasn't completely clear to me on how that was doing it. So I imagine if we're trying to explain it to our constituents, that would be helpful if you had some clear messaging, and some examples I think are really helpful to have.
That's a good recommendation, and we are talking about that messaging, working also with Austin Energy in terms of trying to get information into bill inserts, and looking to provide that messaging. But you're right, the next billing cycle would be based on an actual read that is intended to true up consumption, but it also will provide us, I think, the additional benefit of giving people time to have leaks repaired, but also gives us time to have some detailed review. We're still getting the meter reads, we're just not billing based on it. So in the interim, we'll be reviewing those reads as they come in, and to try and proactively identify customers who were impacted and make any other adjustments that would be necessary based on individual customers' actual levels of consumption.
Okay, so
Okay,
when you explain it, can I just ask, when you explain it, can you make sure you have examples of if you didn't have water, if you were a normal customer, and if you had a leak, please? Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is just take and ask Director Massaros if you all can do this. If you could just take 5 minutes for the last piece. I want people to understand what's happening with the recovery efforts, but then I'd like to leave another 5 minutes for additional questions. I know Councilmember Toba had a question and others may have a question. So do you think you could do that? Could you just take about 5 minutes and give us that last item?
You bet. Randy's going to do that, and Randy, do it in 5 minutes.
I can do that, absolutely. And to that note, there's only one slide, so I should be able to fly through that to give y'all ample time to ask your questions. So as soon as Austin Water's system began to rebound from the significant weather event, we rerouted our incident command focus to turn immediately to those that were suffering from private side failures throughout our community. As our mission describes, we provide water services so that all community needs for water are met, and Austin Water and its employees are passionate about making sure that there is water flowing from every tap at every resident in our community. That said, this community recovery required us to shift what is our traditional focus and our traditional boundaries around providing water service that stops explicitly at the meter, but knowing that so many Austinites and our community members and our neighbors and friends and family were suffering, we deployed resources and put items in place to render aid. So one of the most dire things that I'll start out with and prevailing issues that we continue to struggle with throughout standing up this community recovery effort was the lack of plumbing materials available. As the entire state of Texas flooded the market with needed parts and repair pieces, that became a dire need of our utility to be able to have the components to repair, because as I mentioned, we were assisting in areas and standing up items on hydrants that we've never had to deploy at that level before. And so that became a sticking point, but we've worked through that, and I'm happy to report out where we are today. And so we really developed through our incident command structure a five-pronged approach to this community recovery effort. And so that consists of plumbing repair coordination, and I'll speak a little bit to each of these items: public water stations, bulk water hauling distribution, a fixed location tank in the center of town, and also water totes, which is in essence a 275-gallon water tank, and setting those out in distribution points throughout our community. And so to kind of give some more insight, when this effort first became kind of imminent, we pulled Austin Water staff that have plumbing license, irrigation license, and those that are experts kind of in dealing with private side infrastructure and how they connect to our meters. We pulled them from the field and asked them to make outbound calls to community apartment complexes maintenance staff so that we could have a robust and detailed understanding of what exactly was failing on the private side. Was this internal to the building? Was this piping that was underneath parking spaces, et cetera? And so we stood that out, and as we continued to learn more, we deployed those same staff to meet with those apartment complexes and community to make sure. An example I would provide of that is there was one apartment complex that was out of water. They had a plumber on site that was struggling to make those connections and was trying to work through the wee hours of the night and into the dark. And so we routed Austin Water staff who had construction lights that we usually use when we're doing overnight construction efforts on water lines and water mains in our system. So that way that plumber could continue to work through the nighttime hours. We also had Austin Water staff and Austin Water staff family members providing bottled water on top of what was already being provided throughout the community. And so I just want to, elevate what a significant lift and effort this took from Austin Water staff. And so the other item, making these outbound calls, what started out with about 5 individuals, with that first onset of about 20 apartment complexes, significantly grew as we continued to get and hear from, your offices and your constituents that were reporting outages, as well as other avenues and survey points throughout the city. And so we have stood up additional Austin Water volunteers, as well as other city staff that are making these outbound calls to help us validate these water outage concerns. And so to date, I want to report out on our public water stations. We have 51 public water stations in place throughout the city today, with that number rising to probably 55 by the end of the afternoon, maybe right now. Just an update there, that is the actual connections to the hydrant. So these are our hydrant assemblies with a spigot that allows someone to place a bucket or a bottle, whatever they might have to fill up to supply their water needs. And then bulk water hauling distribution, we have 14 sites that are growing, that are on a route, that are receiving bulk water distribution throughout the city. These are large trucks delivering potable water throughout these apartment complex. And then we have a fixed location tank that is pictured on this slide that is at ACC Northridge campus. And so that is supplying water that anyone throughout the community, whether residential or in an apartment complex multifamily setup, can utilize and receive that water that is needed for their homes. And then water totes, as I mentioned, the kind of 275-gallon tanks, those are also situated throughout our service area at different apartment complexes and communities, so that they can, and those are also on routes to be refilled by our bulk water tanker trucks as those go empty. And so we partnered with Austin Needs Water and other nonprofits throughout the city to get those totes distributed. And so right now, what I can provide the update on, and this will conclude my presentation so we can move on to your questions, is that nearly 350 complexes are confirmed to now have water restored, which we are happy to report that number. There are 83 field verifications going on throughout today this afternoon that will be verified by close of business and early morning tomorrow, that have been listed as non-validated on our map that's outward facing to the public. And by unvalidated, I really want to clarify and indicate that that doesn't mean that we have not contacted. A lot of these complexes, we've contacted them by phone and the phone numbers that have been provided, but we have not had a return phone call. And so those are the ways in which we're deploying Austin Code and Public Works staff, as well as Austin Water staff, to visit those sites in person to either affirm that they are back in water service or still without, so that we can immediately deploy a water resource to them. And so, the situation continues to change rapidly. We're happy that, we had several decline our hydrant use across the city because they were already restored. So that's a great moving target to report out on. And with that, I'll just say that, the system overall seems to be stabilizing, and we'll turn it over for any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you very much. If we could take the slides down. So we have about, we started about 10 minutes late. So if Director Masaris and his folks can stay for another 5 or 10 minutes, I would appreciate that. We won't go any longer than that. Maybe we can do it in 5 if people don't have questions. I did want to circle back around. First off, I want to say thank you for your efforts working with the apartments. I want to second what Councilmember Kassar had said. I think that many of us here have been working very closely with you guys and with the community on the apartment complexes and other facilities, like senior facilities and facility folks, to try to help that effort. So we appreciate everything that you all have done.
Councilmember, I would note, Randy mentioned it, but I do want to thank Austin Needs Water and other volunteer groups.
Yes.
They have been working tirelessly, and I just acknowledge their passion for community service.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn to Councilmember Tovo. Did you have a question? Just want, maybe take a short question. I was sorry to have to cut you off earlier, but we're wrapping up now. So if you have a question, and then we'll turn to a couple of other wrap-up things.
Yeah, I have several. Try to summarize them.
Can't quite hear you, Councilmember Tovo.
I said, yes, I have several, but I'll try to summarize them. Let me just start where you ended. Thank you. I want to add my thanks. And also, I just want to acknowledge the Austin Firefighters Association and the UPO, who I think have together grown into Austin Needs Water and the other community efforts, but they were out there, the day after the boil water notice with buckets that they got from, council offices and from their own efforts, and really started this model of getting water on site at a time where we couldn't access bottled water, even for some of our most vulnerable residents in every council district. So thank you so much for working with them and kind of absorbing and making this an Austin Water utility effort as well. I think this is really a good place to be. Can you help? How many complexes are verified as still out of water? Is it a match with with the number of hydrants?
It is a match.
My colleague had said that, in every case, that there's an equivalency there between the complexes that are still without water and the number that now have on-site water options for household use.
Yes, it is a match on that. When you kind of add up the number of hydrants that we have deployed, and then the apartment complexes that are on the bulk water distribution routing. And then lastly, the one item that Austin Needs Water has performed a heavy lift on, and I don't have an exact count of that, but they have taken totes and gotten those out to those apartment complexes. So I would say the outage is kind of dynamic and changing around the hour as people come on and out, but I would say around 80.
Okay, thank you for that update. And the breweries, I know they were also thanked at several of our meetings, but the breweries really came in early and consistently to help out. Director Mazaros, back to the earlier presentation. I just want to be clear. I think I am from your presentation, but it's come up a couple times in the public questioning about whether the outages at Longhorn Dam and others were all storm related, as I understand. They are absolutely on the high priority circuit. So those were not part of any planned outages. Those were to the extent that that Ulrich and Longhorn Dam had power outages, those were result of storm damage. Is that an accurate understanding?
I know the Ulrich outage was from storm damage. I don't know the other facilities. Longhorn Dam, we'd have to check with Austin Energy. I think some of the smaller lift stations that are in neighborhoods were probably part of the blackout process.
Okay, maybe we can flag that for conversation at some point. Thank you.
Okay, Rick may know. Rick, do you know?
So typically those, even the lift stations, are on the critical load list. And so they may also have been related to storm-related outages, but we'll confirm that.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Okay, I want to wrap up now. Because do you have a short question? Because I also want to give a few minutes to, or one or 2 minutes to City Manager Cronk before we close in 6 minutes. So do you have a short question, Councilmember Alter?
I think so. It's on the emergency preparedness. I really appreciate all the work that was done. I thought that there were lessons that were learned from the prior water boil notice about having water available in those distributions. Can you tell us what you were supposed to have done in the after action report from the prior water boil notice that helped in this situation?
I'm not sure if you mean with bottled water? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
I don't think we identified creating a bottled water warehouse. If that's what I had indicated in my introduction.
I'm saying that in the prior water from the turbidity event, I thought there was an after action report that included some recommendations with respect to how we improve water distribution in the event of a water boil notice.
I'll have to refamiliarize myself with some of that. There was an after action report on our engineering for chemical for turbidity, and then there was an overall one from the EOC, and I'll have to review that with them. I don't recall the recommendations on bottled water distribution.
Okay, we can follow up with that later then.
Okay, thank you very much. So just in closing, I want to thank you, Director, and your team for providing this information for us today. And, we all have many more questions, which we will have, opportunities to ask. I appreciate you flagged close to 10 areas for us to be talking about in the future that you are already thinking of in terms of next steps, and in all the way from storing water to the water forward kinds of recommendations to the explanation of what is occurring in Oldridge with the new construction, the smart meters, examining the potential code changes or other things related to private failures of pipe structures, leak detection, pressure management, the fact that the cast iron pipes were causing breakage, text message delays, lessons about dripping differently, all of those kinds of things. And I know there'll be other issues as you all go through an after action report. So appreciate your efforts to start to identify issues that can be examined in ways in which we may do things better so that we're more resilient in the future. So as we close, I want to ask City Manager, he has something he would like to report to us.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Chair Kitchen and all council members for having such an engaged discussion this afternoon. This is, as you've noted, just one of the many that we'll be having over the next several weeks and months ahead, looking at this event and how we can make sure that we're prepared in different ways in the future. I want to thank our city staff. You know, they have been working tirelessly throughout this event and continue to do so as we make sure that we're not only still in the response mode, but then shifting into recovery and then finally looking back at what we can do better in the future. I'll just note that we took the resolution that you passed last Thursday very seriously, and I know there were some immediate things that were asked of staff, and so we are prepared to, and if it's not in your inbox already, it will be arriving shortly. We do have an initial response to that, so hopefully that will start again framing our conversation going forward, but just wanted to give you a heads up to look for that. I know that we were asked to come up with a response before tomorrow's council meeting, and we're fulfilling that promise, and here there's at least an executive summary of some of the things that we've been working on in real time. I will note, though, that some of the numbers have even been updated in the day that we've been crafting this memo, and so some of the things that you heard from Ms. Jenkins are updated that you got today that maybe have changed since we put the memo together. So just wanted to give you a heads up on that and look forward to our discussion tomorrow at council as well.
Thank you. Councilmember Renteria?
I just have a quick request that we also look into our small minorities and other businesses that have been struggling with the COVID, and now they have busted pipes and now they're going to have to be facing all kinds of regulations with the health department code, and I just want to make sure that we do them right also.
Thank you. It's a good issue to point out. Okay, guys, I want to thank everybody for participating. I know it can be, it can be frustrating not to be able to get into all the detail that we want to, but I think we covered quite a bit in the last 2 hours, and we'll have future opportunities. As I said before, we'll be meeting jointly with Austin Energy at the end of the month. We have a water committee meeting we'll be adding in April, and then, of course, we appreciate the efforts that Councilmember Tovo is bringing forward with the committee that she signaled and the resolution that she's working on. So thank you all. I really appreciate your time. And thank you, Director Masaris and your team. And with that, I guess I need to adjourn the meeting. We're adjourning the Water Oversight Committee meeting. Thank you.